Deep in a mist-shrouded valley, where ancient bones whisper secrets to the wind, archaeologists uncover evidence of humanity's darkest chapter. Skeletal remains tell a story of violence so brutal, it rewrites everything we thought we knew about our ancestors. This is not just another prehistoric settlement. This is ground zero for the most savage family feud in human history, where blood ran thicker than water, and hatred burned hotter than the fires that once warmed their caves. The discovery begins with a single child's skull, its tiny cranium bearing marks that make even seasoned forensic experts turn away in horror. What they found buried beneath centuries of sediment would challenge every assumption about early human civilization and reveal a truth so dark, it was almost buried forever. 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets covered half the world and survival meant everything, this valley was paradise. Sheltered from the harsh winds by towering cliffs and blessed with a river that never ran dry, it became home to one of the most successful prehistoric communities ever discovered. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated tool-making, complex social structures, and art that rivals anything produced in the famous caves of France. The people who lived here weren't savage cave dwellers. They were artists, innovators, and builders of something extraordinary. Their cave paintings show scenes of abundance, massive hunts bringing down woolly mammoths, elaborate ceremonies under star-filled skies, and children playing games that their descendants would never live to learn. But beneath this veneer of prehistoric perfection, the seeds of destruction were already taking root. Enter Keth the strong-armed and Vorn the wise-eyed, names lost to time but preserved in the oral traditions that somehow survived the carnage to come. Born under the same blood moon, these twin brothers were destined to lead their people into either glory or ruin. Keth, the elder by mere minutes, possessed a strength that bordered on the supernatural. Stories passed down through generations speak of him wrestling cave bears with his bare hands and hurling spears with such force they could pierce mammoth hide at impossible distances. Vorn, his younger twin, lacked his brother's physical prowess but possessed something far more dangerous, an intellect that could see patterns where others saw chaos, and a charisma that could bend others to his will with nothing more than whispered words. Together, they transformed their small tribe into a confederation that dominated the entire region. Under their joint leadership, the valley people became master traders, their influence extending hundreds of miles in every direction. They developed the first known system of prehistoric taxation, established trade routes that lasted millennia, and created a military alliance that kept their territory safe from the constant threat of rival tribes. But power shared between brothers is a delicate thing, and even the strongest bonds can be shattered by the right pressure applied at exactly the wrong moment. Her name was Naya the Beautiful, and she would become the Helen of Troy of the Stone Age. Born to a distant tribe as part of a diplomatic marriage alliance, she arrived in the valley like a comet blazing across the night sky, impossible to ignore and destined to change everything in her path. Physical descriptions preserved in cave art show a woman of extraordinary beauty, but it was her mind that truly set her apart. Naya possessed an intelligence that rivaled Vorn's and a strategic understanding of human nature that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. She understood immediately that her choice between the brothers would determine not just her own fate, but the destiny of an entire civilization. The courtship that followed became the stuff of legend. Keth, confident in his physical superiority and status as eldest, pursued her with the subtlety of a charging mammoth, showering her with gifts of rare furs, exotic stones, and the choicest cuts from every hunt. His approach was direct, overwhelming, and ultimately counterproductive. Vorn, understanding that Naya was not a prize to be won but a partner to be earned, engaged her in long conversations about philosophy, shared with her his vision for their people's future, and treated her as an equal in all things. The choosing ceremony, held during the winter solstice when the barrier between worlds was thinnest, became a pivotal moment in human history. As the entire tribe gathered around the sacred fire, Naya made her choice with words that would echo through generations. I choose the man who sees me not as a possession, but as a partner. Vorn's triumph was complete, but Keth's humiliation ran deeper than any physical wound. That night, as celebrations echoed through the valley and his brother claimed the woman who should have been his, Keth made a decision that would condemn countless generations to a cycle of violence that would make the Trojan War look like a minor disagreement. 3 months after the choosing ceremony, As Naya's belly swelled with Vorn's child, Keth struck with the precision of a predator and the cruelty of a spurned lover. The attack came during the spring fertility festival, when the entire tribe was gathered for celebration and their defenses were at their weakest. Keth had spent months planning his revenge, carefully recruiting supporters from among those who felt overlooked by Vorn's rise to prominence. His coalition included displaced hunters, ambitious young warriors, and older tribesmen who remembered the days when strength mattered more than wisdom. The assault began at dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping gods. Keth and his followers struck simultaneously at multiple targets: Vorn's inner circle, the tribal council chambers, and most horrifically, the birthing caves where Naya had gone to deliver her child. The battle that followed lasted 3 days and nights, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a sudden change in tool-making techniques. Weapons became more sophisticated, more lethal, designed not just to kill but to inflict maximum suffering. The psychological warfare was even more brutal than the physical combat. Keth's forces developed tactics specifically designed to break their enemies' spirits. They poisoned water sources, destroyed food stores, and most chillingly, they began taking children as hostages, forcing parents to choose between loyalty to Vorn and the lives of their offspring. When the smoke finally cleared, the valley that had known 20,000 years of relative peace was forever changed. Vorn retained control of the main settlement, but Keth had established a rival stronghold in the northern caves. The child that should have united the next generation, Naya and Vorn's son, was born into a world already stained with his uncle's blood. Most tragically of all, Naya herself did not survive the birthing. Whether from complications of childbirth or from wounds sustained during the attack remains unclear. What is certain is that her death removed the last restraining influence on both brothers, transforming their conflict from a personal rivalry into something far more dangerous: a holy war. What followed was not war as we understand it, but something far more insidious. A generational curse that infected every child born into both bloodlines. The conflict evolved from a dispute between brothers into a cultural institution, with each side developing elaborate mythologies to justify their continued violence. Vorn's followers, calling themselves the Children of the Wise Eye, developed a belief system centered on the idea that Keth's bloodline carried a spiritual corruption that could only be cleansed through complete eradication. They taught their children that showing mercy to Keth's descendants was not just foolish, but actively sinful, a betrayal of their ancestors and their gods. Keth's faction, naming themselves the Sons of the Strong Arm, created an equally toxic mythology that portrayed Vorn's line as weak pretenders who had stolen power through trickery and deceit. Their children were raised to believe that reclaiming their rightful place as leaders required not just defeating their enemies, but making them suffer as their ancestors had suffered. The archaeological record from this period reveals a society that had become completely militarized. Tools that had once been used for hunting and crafting were redesigned as weapons. Art that had once celebrated life and fertility became focused obsessively on death and revenge. Even children's toys were miniature weapons, designed to train the next generation for the war they would inherit. The violence escalated with each passing generation, as each side sought to outdo their ancestors in brutality. What began as ambushes and raids evolved into systematic campaigns of terror. Entire families were wiped out in their sleep, their bodies arranged in ritualistic displays designed to send messages of fear and dominance. Archaeological evidence reveals innovations in torture techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the darkest periods of recorded history. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors from both sides began exhibiting what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of severe PTSD. Cave paintings from this period show recurring themes of nightmares, paranoia, and what appears to be survivor's guilt. The valley that had once been a beacon of prehistoric civilization became a laboratory for humanity's capacity for infinite cruelty. The most chilling aspect of this generational war was how it became self-perpetuating. Children who had never known peace couldn't imagine it. Mothers taught their babies to hate before they could walk. Fathers trained their sons to kill before they could properly speak. The feud became more than a conflict. It became an identity, the defining characteristic of what it meant to belong to either bloodline. By the fifth generation after the first betrayal, the conflict had evolved into something that transcended mere human warfare and entered the realm of systematic extermination. The descendants of Keth and Vorn no longer remembered why they fought. The original grievances had been buried under centuries of accumulated atrocities. What remained was pure, distilled hatred, passed down like a genetic trait from parent to child. The archaeological evidence from this period is so disturbing that several research teams have requested psychological counseling after studying it. Mass graves containing entire extended families, including infants who couldn't have posed any threat to anyone. Skeletal remains showing evidence of torture techniques so sophisticated, they suggest the development of specialists whose sole purpose was inflicting maximum suffering. Most horrifying of all, evidence of ritualistic cannibalism practiced not out of hunger, but as a form of psychological warfare designed to destroy the enemy's spiritual beliefs about the afterlife. The valley itself began to reflect the darkness of its inhabitants. The river that had once run clear became polluted with blood and refuse. The fertile soil that had supported abundant agriculture became contaminated with human remains. Even the wildlife began to abandon the area, as if the very animals could sense the evil that had taken root in what was once paradise. During this period, both sides developed increasingly elaborate ritual practices around their violence. Death was no longer enough. Enemies had to be made to suffer in ways that honored the suffering of one's own ancestors. Archaeological evidence suggests the development of specialized roles within each tribe: torturers, executioners, and even individuals whose sole responsibility was preserving the oral traditions of grievance that justified continued warfare. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. Cave paintings from this era show increasingly abstract and disturbing imagery: spirals that never end, figures trapped in eternal cycles of violence, and symbols that seem to represent madness itself. Mental illness, previously virtually unknown in prehistoric societies with strong community support systems, became endemic. The most tragic aspect of this period was the complete breakdown of any cultural restraints on violence. Earlier generations had at least maintained some boundaries. Certain sacred places were off limits. Certain times of year were reserved for peace. Certain categories of people, the very young, the very old, pregnant women, were considered non-combatants. By the time of shadows, no such restrictions remained. Everything and everyone became a legitimate target, and the only law was the law of vengeance. The end began with a child's laughter. It was the first time such a sound had been heard in the valley for over 3 generations, and it came from the lips of Kara, a 7-year-old girl who had somehow managed to retain her innocence despite being born into a world consumed by hatred. She was the last child born to Vorn's bloodline, the final descendant of a genetic legacy that stretched back to the dawn of human civilization. Her counterpart in Keth's bloodline was a boy named Thane, barely 12 years old but already carrying scars that told the story of a childhood spent in warfare. These two children, who should have been playing together and learning the peaceful arts their ancestors had mastered, instead became the focal points for the final, apocalyptic phase of their family's mutual destruction. By this time, the original tribes had been reduced to handfuls of survivors, each group consisting of no more than 20 or 30 individuals, but their hatred had not diminished with their numbers. If anything, it had become more concentrated, more pure, like poison distilled to its most lethal essence. The archaeological evidence suggests that both sides spent months planning what they knew would be the final battle, a confrontation that would end with the complete extinction of their enemies. The preparations were elaborate and horrifying. Weapons were crafted not just to kill, but to inflict maximum psychological trauma on those who witnessed their use. Poisons were developed that would cause slow, agonizing deaths. Most chillingly, both sides began incorporating the bones of their own ancestors into their weapons, believing that this would give them spiritual power over their enemies. The final battle, when it came, lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. It was fought not in the open field like the conflicts of previous generations, but in the sacred caves where both bloodlines had once worshipped their gods together. The desecration was intentional. Each side sought not just to kill their enemies, but to destroy their very souls by denying them proper burial in consecrated ground. The fighting was so intense that the cave walls still bear scorch marks from the fires that burned throughout the conflict. But it was not the violence itself that made this confrontation unique. It was the complete abandonment of any pretense of humanity. Archaeological evidence suggests that both sides practiced ritual torture, forced cannibalism, and psychological warfare techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the most extreme conflicts of recorded history. Children were forced to watch their parents die slowly. Parents were made to choose which of their children would be killed first. The weak were kept alive specifically to suffer longer than the strong. When the smoke finally cleared and the last weapon fell silent, only 5 individuals remained alive. 3 from Keth's bloodline and 2 from Vorn's. But their hatred was so complete, their need for vengeance so absolute, that even facing the extinction of both their peoples, they could not find peace. The final act of this prehistoric tragedy took place in what archaeologists now call the Chamber of Last Things. There was a small cave deep within the mountain where the 5 survivors gathered for what they knew would be their final confrontation. But what happened there transcended mere violence and entered the realm of ritualistic madness that challenges our very understanding of human nature. The survivors, 2 elderly men, 2 middle-aged women, and 1 teenage boy, had lived their entire lives knowing nothing but war. They had never experienced peace, never known love that wasn't tainted by loss, never seen beauty that wasn't shadowed by the memory of violence. They were, in essence, the walking dead, kept alive only by the burning need to see their enemies destroyed. The archaeological evidence from the Chamber of Last Things tells a story so horrific that researchers initially refused to believe their own findings. The bone analysis reveals that the survivors engaged in ritualistic cannibalism, but not out of hunger or desperation. This was something far more sinister. They consumed their enemy's flesh, believing that it would transfer not just their strength, but their memories, their skills, and ultimately their capacity to suffer. The remains suggest that this final feast lasted for days, with the survivors taking turns being both predator and prey in a grotesque parody of the communion rituals their ancestors had once used to celebrate life and community. They had created a religion of death, with cannibalism as their sacrament and mutual destruction as their ultimate goal. The psychological state of these final survivors can only be imagined. Cut off from any contact with the outside world, surrounded by the bones of countless ancestors, they had descended into a form of madness that was both individual and collective. They spoke to the dead, incorporated the voices of their victims into their own personalities, and began to see themselves not as the last of their people, but as the instruments of some cosmic justice that demanded complete annihilation. The final entry in this prehistoric book of horrors came when the last 2 survivors, one from each bloodline, faced each other in what was simultaneously a duel and a suicide pact. The bone evidence suggests that they killed each other slowly, methodically, taking turns inflicting wounds until they were both too weak to continue. They died within arm's reach of each other, their fingers almost touching, their blood mingling on the cave floor in a final ironic unity that had been impossible in life. Today, 15,000 years after the last blood was spilled, the valley lies silent beneath a canopy of ancient trees that have grown over the graves of the forgotten, but the earth still remembers. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed the full scope of this prehistoric holocaust. Over 800 confirmed deaths across multiple generations, making it proportionally bloodier than many modern genocides. The forensic evidence tells a story of systematic brutality that challenges every assumption we held about our early ancestors and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature itself. The discovery has rewritten textbooks and shattered romantic notions about prehistoric harmony. We now know that the capacity for infinite cruelty, for generational hatred, for the complete dehumanization of our enemies, has always been part of the human condition. The people who created the cave paintings of Lascaux, who developed the first tools and tamed the first fires, were also capable of atrocities that rival anything in recorded history. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this ancient tragedy is how familiar it feels to modern eyes. The cycle of violence, the mythologies of victimhood, the way hatred can become a cultural inheritance passed down from parent to child. These patterns repeat themselves throughout human history, from the blood feuds of medieval Scotland to the ethnic conflicts of the modern world. Standing in the valley today, surrounded by the peace of wind-stirred grass and the songs of birds who have built their nests in the soil enriched by ancient bones, we are forced to confront a terrible question. How many times has this story played out across human history? How many families, tribes, and nations have destroyed themselves in pursuit of vengeance that ultimately left no victors, only victims? The valley where time forgot has become a mirror, reflecting back to us our own capacity for both creation and destruction. In the end, both bloodlines succeeded in their ultimate goal. They completely destroyed their enemies. But victory came at a price that made triumph indistinguishable from defeat. They achieved the perfect revenge, mutual annihilation so complete that both names vanished from history, leaving only bones to whisper their warning to those wise enough to listen. As we walk away from this place where hatred once ruled supreme, we carry with us a cautionary tale that spans the millennia, a reminder that some wounds never heal, some feuds can only end in extinction, and that the greatest enemy of humanity has always been humanity itself.